What Clara never imagined was that the key to understanding her own life lay hidden in the shadows of a past no one dared touch. When her grandmother passed away, leaving a mysterious inheritance, a letter, and an enigmatic object, Clara found herself faced with secrets that could shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew. But the deeper she delves into this search, the more the answers seem to elude her, revealing a mystery that could ultimately transform not only her story, but that of her entire family. Is Clara ready to face what the past has in store for her? The echo of her own footsteps was Clara's only company in the vast, silent house. The air was a thick mixture of dried lavender, which her grandmother used to keep in sachets, and the pungent smell of dust and aging paper. Outside, a late afternoon sun painted the sky orange, but inside the house, the shadows were already stretching, swallowing the corners of the rooms like a slow tide. Clara's task was monumental, almost an act of archaeology. To unearth an entire life only to paradoxically entomb it in cardboard boxes. Donate. Keep. Trash. The white labels were the only order amidst the sentimental chaos of objects that had lost their owner. She moved with a cold efficiency, an armor she had donned to shield herself from grief. It was easier to focus on the logistics than on the absence. Her grandmother, Helena, had always been an enigmatic figure, a distant satellite in her life's orbit. Her memories of her were fragments. Delicate hands tending to a lush garden, a gaze that seemed to see through walls, and a silence that spoke more than any words. Feeling her loss was like trying to hold smoke in her hands. Her fingers, coated in a thin layer of dust, paused on the spine of a worn, hardcover book on the living room shelf. It was a copy of a classic novel, its pages yellowed at the edges. As she pulled it out, she felt an unusual resistance, a bulk that didn't belong to the book. A thick ivory-colored envelope slid out and landed on the hardwood floor with a soft, almost inaudible thud. Clara stood motionless for a moment. Her breath, once steady and calm, caught in her throat. Everything in this house was predictable, catalogued old. This envelope was an anomaly. She picked it up. The paper was heavy, high quality, and sealed with a disc of dark red wax, almost the color of wine. At the center of the seal was an embossed crest she had never seen before. A stylized bird, maybe an eagle or a falcon, its wings spread in defiance, as if about to take flight from the wax. Her hands, which until then had moved with the precision of an automaton, froze in midair. The routine of organizing had been broken. This object didn't belong in this world of trinkets and faded picture frames. Using the tip of an old brass letter opener from the desk, she broke the seal. The sound of the wax cracking was a dry, loud snap in the oppressive silence. The handwriting on the yellowed paper was elegant, with fluid curves, but the pressure of the pen revealed a contained urgency. This was not a farewell letter full of affection. It was a set of instructions, a map. Clara, the note began. If you are reading this, the silence that has protected me for so long has been broken. There are truths that cannot remain buried, for their roots run too deep. Your truth begins where everything blooms, but nothing is as it seems. Look for the key you need, but know this. It does not open the door you expect. A shiver ran down her neck, electric and cold. The key you need. The phrase pulsed on the page. What key? Her eyes, now alert, swept the room, scanning every corner, every surface covered by a white sheet. Her grandmother's mahogany desk caught her eye. She had already emptied it, or so she thought. The drawers were all open and bare. Frustrated, she ran her hands over the smooth surface, then underneath, searching for a false bottom, a cabinet maker's trick. Nothing. A heavy sigh escaped her lips. On an impulse, she shoved the desk, the sound of its wooden feet dragging on the floor an assault on the silence. It was then that she heard a different sound. Not the continuous scrape, but a faint clack, as if a piece had shifted. She stopped and looked down. One of the desk's legs had slid over the edge of a floorboard, lifting it slightly. The outline was almost imperceptible, disguised by the wood grain. Her heart accelerated, pounding against her ribs. She knelt, the fabric of her jeans protesting, and forced her fingernails into the tiny crevice. The board gave way with a low groan, revealing a dark, dusty recess. There, nestled perfectly inside, was a dark, almost black wooden box. and on its lid, carved with stunning precision, the same bird from the wax seal stared back at her. The box wasn't locked. With bated breath, holding the air in her lungs, Clara lifted the lid. The interior was lined with purple velvet, now faded and frayed by time. Resting on the fabric like a sacred relic was a single object, a key. It was made of dark iron, its surface irregular, clearly hand-forged. This was no mass-produced key with its precise cuts. The head was an arabesque of twisted metal, and the shaft, worn from use, ended in complex, asymmetrical teeth. She picked it up. The metal was cold and surprisingly heavy, as if it held not just the promise of opening a lock, but the weight of all the years it had remained hidden. The weight of a secret. Clara rose slowly, the key in one hand, the letter in the other. She walked to the desk and placed the key on the wooden surface. The dull thud broke the spell of silence, a final, definitive sound. There, under the dim twilight filtering through the window, lay the three elements of the enigma: the letter, the box, and the key. Her life, until that moment a straight and predictable line, had just curved toward a labyrinth. Her grandmother's legacy wasn't the house or the few belongings. It was this dangerous invitation to a past she never knew existed. A past that, according to Helena's words, began in the garden, the place where everything bloomed, but nothing was as it seemed. What did Helena hide in her backyard garden? And what door is this mysterious key destined to open? If you want to solve this enigma with Clara, like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter, and leave your theory in the comments. The hunt for the truth has only just begun. The pale morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. On the wooden table, the artifacts of her grandmother's enigma rested like pieces from an unknown board game. The letter, with its urgent script, the dark wooden box, now empty, and the iron key, whose weight still felt strange and significant in Clara's hand. She hadn't slept well. The night had been a tangle of feverish dreams and dark corridors. Now, the silence of the house was no longer peaceful, but expectant. With the tip of her finger, she traced the words in the letter. The past is a shadow that always returns. The phrase sounded less like a cliché and more like a warning. She turned the page with reverent care. There was the drawing that had intrigued her. It wasn't a map in the traditional sense, with scales and legends. It was an artistic, almost childlike, rendering of the backyard garden. The paper was fragile, the iron gall ink lines already faded to a sepia tone. A stylized sun marked the location of the house, and a winding path, dotted with small symbols, a crescent moon next to the old oak tree, 3 stars near the rose bush, led to an endpoint. This point was a more detailed drawing, a cluster of circles representing the large rock formation at the edge of the property, a place her grandmother used to call the sleeping giant. Her gaze returned to the key in her hand. Yesterday, in the rush of discovery, she hadn't examined it with proper care. Now, under the morning light, she turned it between her fingers. The metal was cold and irregular. It was then that she felt a small indentation on the ornate head of the key, something that wasn't part of the design. Tilting it against the light, she saw it. Engraved there, tiny and worn, was a symbol. A wheel with 8 spokes, resembling an ancient sun symbol or a ship's wheel. It was subtle, almost erased, but undeniably present. The same sun symbol was drawn on the map, at the starting point. This was no coincidence. A chill ran down her arms, despite the warmth beginning to build in the kitchen. No more hesitating. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the floor, and put the letter and the empty box in a drawer. The key, however, she held tight in her hand, the cold metal serving as an anchor for her wavering courage. With decisive steps, she walked toward the back door, toward the garden. The place that had been the stage for her childhood games now seemed different, charged with new meaning. The smell of damp earth and wild mint was the same, but the trees' shadows seemed longer, darker. The buzz of a solitary bee seemed too loud in the silence. With the makeshift map in one hand and the key in the other, she followed the winding path. She passed the oak tree with its imaginary crescent moon, rounded the rose bush where the 3 stars were supposed to be, feeling simultaneously foolish and compelled by a greater force. Each step took her further from the safe house, closer to the sleeping giant. The rocks were exactly as she remembered them, a chaotic pile of smooth, moss-covered stones. She stopped, consulting the drawing one last time before tucking it into her pocket. The air here felt colder. A sudden wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, and for an instant, Clara had the distinct feeling that she wasn't alone. She spun around, her heart racing. Nothing, just the swaying of branches. Ignoring the shiver down her spine, she focused on the task. She knelt in the damp earth, examining the base of the rock formation. Her hands ran over the cold, rough surface of the stones. They seemed solid, immovable. Frustration began to bubble up. Was this all a game of her grandmother's? A treasure hunt with no prize? She knocked with her knuckles on one of the larger stones, a dull, solid sound. She knocked on another, and then on the third, the sound was different. Hollow, a low, deep thump that resonated distinctly. Her breath hitched. She knocked again. The same sound. With her nails and fingertips, she began to dig away the dirt and moss around the base of the stone. The soil got under her nails, but she didn't care. The stone was set in place, but it seemed loose. Bracing herself on her knees, she pushed with her body weight. The stone gave way with a dragging groan, revealing a dark cavity underneath. And inside that cavity was another box. This one was more rustic than the first, made of light-colored wood weathered by time and moisture. A small brass lock, green with oxidation, kept it sealed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mix of triumph and dread. With trembling hands, she took out the iron key. The complex shape of its teeth seemed impossible, but when she inserted it into the lock, it slid in as if it had been made for that very purpose. She turned the key. A metallic click, loud and clear, echoed through the garden. The box was open. Carefully, she lifted the lid. The smell of must and old paper rose from its interior. Inside, on a piece of purple velvet identical to the one in the first box, was a small bundle of documents tied with a faded ribbon and a photograph. She picked up the photo first. It was a black and white portrait, faded at the edges. It showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, leaning against a brick wall. Her eyes were large and defiant, and a half-smile played on her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was a deep sadness there, a melancholy that contrasted with her defiant posture. Clara felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't her grandmother, but there was an undeniable resemblance in the curve of her chin, the shape of her eyes. It was a family face. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in the same elegant, urgent script as the letter, was a single word: freedom. The word hung in her mind, heavy with a weight she couldn't decipher. Freedom from what? Or for whom? The puzzle pieces were multiplying, not fitting together. What did this woman, this word, have to do with her grandmother's reclusive life? The wind blew again, stronger this time, and the feeling of being watched returned with full force. She jumped to her feet, grabbing the box, and looked around at the deepening shadows in the garden. There was no one there, but the feeling was real. The answers she sought weren't just in the past. They felt alive, present, hidden in the shadows of this very garden. And she felt, with a terrifying certainty, that the shadows were closing in. Who is the mysterious woman in the photo? And what secrets does the word freedom hide? With every step, Clara sinks deeper into a mystery that could be far too dangerous. If you want to continue on this journey, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment with your theories. The weight of family silence is about to be confronted. Clara returned to her own house, but the silence here was different from the one at her grandmother's. It wasn't a silence of absence, but a silence of expectation, thick like the calm before a storm. She needed answers, and the most obvious, and most frightening, source was her parents. She waited for late afternoon, the time when the household routine settled down. Instead of asking casually, she set the stage. She placed the faded photograph and the heavy iron key in the center of the dining room table, like a lawyer presenting evidence to a jury. She sat down and waited, her heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her chest. Her parents entered the dining room from opposite directions. Her mother, Maria, wore a tired smile that froze when she saw Clara's expression and the objects on the table. Her father, John, a man whose economy of words was legendary, stopped in the doorway. His eyes, normally passive, focused first on the key, then on the photo, and his face closed up like a vault door. Maria was the first to approach, wiping her hands on her apron in a nervous gesture. Clara? What's this? Did something happen? John said nothing. He walked slowly to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat, but his posture was rigid, defensive. He didn't look at Clara, but at the artifacts on the polished wood. I found this at Grandma's house, Clara said, her voice sounding firmer than she felt. She pushed the photograph to the center of the table. It was hidden. Who is this woman? The silence that followed was absolute, so deep that the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a scream. John set down the fork he was holding with a metallic clatter that made Maria jump. Your grandmother is barely cold in her grave, and you're already rummaging through her things like a vulture? John's voice was low, but sharp as broken glass. It was an attack, not an answer. Dad, I just want to understand. Understand what? He retorted, finally looking up at her. His gaze was cold, impenetrable. That some things should be left in peace? That the past should be respected? Buried along with the dead? John, please. Maria whispered, placing a trembling hand on her husband's arm. A silent plea for him to stop. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the photo with an expression of old pain, as if she were seeing a ghost. Clara ignored her father's aggression. She turned the photo over, revealing the word written on the back. Freedom. What does this mean? And this key? It was all hidden. Grandma left a letter. She wanted me to find it. At the word freedom, Maria gasped, a tiny choke sound. She snatched her hand back from John's arm as if she'd been shocked. Maria, John said, his tone now a stern warning, without even glancing at his wife. But it was too late. Her mother's reaction was a confession. They knew. Mom, Clara's voice broke for the first time. What is this? Why are you acting like this? Maria looked from her husband to her daughter, her lips moving silently for a moment. Her eyes welled up. Clara, honey, some stories don't have heroes. Some doors, when opened, only reveal pain. What your grandmother did, what she had to do, that belongs to her. She was my grandmother. This is my family. I have a right to know. Clara's frustration finally boiled over. She stood up, her hands flat on the table. With a swift motion, she grabbed the iron key. This isn't just a piece of metal. It's a piece of our history, and you're hiding it from me. Why? What are you so afraid of? John stood up too, his body creating a barrier between Clara and her mother. His initial calm had transformed into a contained fury that vibrated in the air. Afraid? I'm not afraid. I have common sense. Something you seem to have lost. You're poking a hornet's nest, girl, without any idea how big the hornets are. Then tell me. Help me understand. There's nothing to understand, he nearly shouted, his voice echoing in the silent room. John, Maria pleaded, now in tears. Don't talk to her like that. She turned to Clara, her face etched with the agony of an impossible choice. Honey, listen to your father. Please. There are debts, Clara. Debts that she didn't pay, and that shouldn't be paid by you. Let her rest in peace. Let us have peace. Debts. Clara repeated the word, feeling a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. That word was concrete. It was real. It wasn't a ghost. It was a threat. The mention of the word debts seemed to be the last straw for John. Enough, he said, his voice now deathly calm. He took Maria by the arm, gently but firmly. This conversation is over. Let's go, Maria. He led her out of the room, leaving Clara alone with the ringing silence and a new, terrifying piece of the puzzle. The wall her parents had built wasn't just made of silence. It was made of fear, a palpable fear, which had a name, debt. And Clara, looking at the key in her hand, understood that no matter what they said, she wouldn't stop. Not now that she knew her grandmother's secret wasn't just a sad story. It was something dangerous and unfinished. A debt from the past. A secret kept out of fear. Clara is more alone than ever, and the answers seem to be hidden in places her parents refused to mention. Where can she look now? Perhaps in the most forgotten place in the house, the attic. If you think she should continue, like this video, subscribe, and comment on what you think this debt could mean. The echo of her parents' words, "Det, hornet's nest," chased Clara all the way back to her grandmother's house. The confrontation had left her with a chilling certainty. She was on her own. If there were answers, they wouldn't come from familiar faces, but from forgotten places. And no place in the house was more forgotten than the attic. The staircase leading to the top floor was narrow and dark. Each step groaned under Clara's weight, a chorus of protest from the old wood, as if the house itself were trying to stop her from ascending. At the top, a simple wooden door and a dirty pull cord hanging from the ceiling. She pulled the cord. A single bare bulb flickered twice before coming on, casting a sickly yellow light on the door. The lock was old iron stained with rust. The air up here was already different, colder, with the smell of mothballs and decaying paper. The key. She took it from her pocket. The metal felt even heavier and colder here in the dim light. When she inserted it into the lock, the mechanism groaned in resistance, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. She applied more force. With a heavy, definitive metallic snap that echoed down the empty hallway, the lock gave way. Clara pushed the door, which opened with a long, dragging moan. A gust of stagnant air, the breath of a trapped time, hit her face. The attic was a graveyard of objects. Furniture covered in white sheets looked like ghosts sitting in silence. Piles of yellowed newspapers and collapsing cardboard boxes formed small mountains of discarded memories. The dim light from the bulb barely penetrated the darkness, making the shadows dance and writhe in the corners, giving shape to things that weren't there. Clara entered cautiously, her feet kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The floorboards groaned under her weight. She paused in the center, her senses on high alert. A draft whistled through a crack in the roof, and in the farthest corner, one of the sheets moved slightly. Her entire body tensed. She held her breath, her eyes fixed on the ghostly shape. The sheet fell still. It was just the wind, but the seed of fear had been planted. Her gaze swept over the organized chaos, and then she saw it. It wasn't a cardboard box, but a large, dark-wood steamer trunk with rusted metal straps. It was tossed on its side, partially hidden under a pile of rolled-up rugs. It was different from everything else in here. It looked like it belonged on a ship, not in a suburban attic. Driven by instinct, she approached, dragging the heavy rugs aside. The trunk's lid wasn't locked. With a hammering heart, she lifted it. The scent of dried lavender and camphor rose from within, an attempt to preserve what was stored. There were dresses of an old-fashioned cut, a pair of leather shoes, and underneath it all, a book. It was a leather-bound hardcover, now cracked and faded. The gold leaf letters on the cover were nearly gone, but it was still possible to read a single word. Diary. Fastened to the cover by a metal clasp, a small padlock, red with rust, kept its secret safe. Clara picked up the diary. The leather was cold and brittle to the touch. She tried to force the padlock with her fingers, but it wouldn't budge. It was sealed by time. Her mind went to the key in her pocket. Could it be? It seemed impossible. The key had opened the attic door. Why would it also open a tiny padlock? She hesitated, her father's warning ringing in her head. You're poking a hornet's nest. She looked around at the shadows that seemed to deepen, to draw closer. A floorboard creaked downstairs. Clara froze, her ears straining. Silence. Probably just the old house settling. But the feeling of not being alone was now a physical presence beside her. No more fear. She had to know. She took the key from her pocket. The complex design seemed too large for the small padlock. But as she brought the tip closer, she realized the end of the key, the fine asymmetrical teeth, matched the keyhole exactly. With a trembling hand, she inserted it. A dry metallic click cut through the silence. The padlock sprang open. With bated breath, she opened the diary. The first few pages contained notes of an ordinary life. But as she read on, the handwriting changed, becoming more rushed, almost frantic. Strange symbols began to appear in the margins. And then the drawings. A sketch of the man from the photograph, but his face here was dark, tormented. A drawing of the bird from the wax seal, but it was trapped inside a cage. And the phrases scrawled forcefully on the paper. Freedom has a price, and the debt is always collected. They think I am weak, but a caged bird still remembers how to fly, and how to peck out its jailer's eyes. I saw him again today. The shadow always returns. He will not stop. I must hide everything. Protect my family. Protect the future. The pressure in Clara's chest was intense. The attic air seemed too thin for her lungs. The debt her mother had mentioned. The bird. The man in the photo. He wasn't a lost lover. He was a jailer. A shadow. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the house settling. It was the unmistakable sound of the front door, downstairs, opening and closing with a heavy, muffled thud. Clara's blood ran cold. Someone had entered the house. With a sharp movement, she slammed the diary shut, the sound echoing in the attic. She killed the light with a violent pull on the cord, plunging herself into near-total darkness. Crouched behind the trunk, the diary pressed against her chest, she listened to the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Crossing the floor below, and then stopping. Right at the base of the stairs leading to the attic. Clara is no longer alone in the house. Who is the person who followed her? And what do they want? The search for answers has turned into a fight for survival. If your heart is racing too, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments who you think is in the house. The next chapter might be the most dangerous of all. Crouched in the oppressive darkness of the attic, Clara was a single knot of tension. The leather diary was pressed against her chest so hard the sharp corners dug into her skin. The air escaped her lungs in a silent hiss. The sound of her own heart was a muffled drum in her ears. So loud she feared it could be heard downstairs. The footsteps had stopped. A heavy silence settled, but it was a different kind of silence, a listening silence. Then, a sound made every muscle in her body contract. The first slow groan of the attic stair. Someone was coming up. Her eyes desperately tried to find a place to hide in the near-total darkness, but she was exposed, trapped behind an old trunk. With each creaking step, a new wave of panic washed over her. She had nowhere to run. The door was the only way out, and that was where the sound was headed. The yellow light from the hallway crept up through the cracks in the floorboards, casting long, thin lines of light across the attic. A tall, dark silhouette filled the doorway. The figure paused, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom. Clara held her breath, trying to merge with the shadows. "I know you're in here, girl." The voice was deep and raspy, worn by time and tobacco. "I didn't come to hurt you. I just want what's rightfully mine." The silhouette took a step into the attic. A man, older, maybe her father's age, with shoulders stooped by the weight of years. He limped slightly, favoring his right leg. In his hand, he held a flashlight, but he didn't turn it on. How did you get in?" Clara's voice came out as a trembling whisper. "Your grandmother gave me a key a long time ago," the man said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "A key for an emergency. And Helena, bless her heart, always knew this day would come." He took another step. "She left the diary for you, didn't she? Cunning woman. Knew you'd be curious enough to find it. But she never intended for you to read it. She intended for you to deliver it." Deliver it to who? Clara forced herself to ask, her mind spinning. "To me," he said simply. "My name is Miguel, and I was your grandmother's friend. The only friend who knew the truth." Miguel finally switched on the flashlight. The beam swept across the attic, making the white sheets glow like apparitions, before landing directly on Clara, crouched behind the trunk. She flinched, blinded by the light. "Hand it over, Clara. It's too heavy a burden for you to carry." "No," she said, the word coming out with more force than she expected. "Not until you tell me what this truth is. Who is the man in the diary? The jailer? Who is the shadow?" Miguel let out a heavy sigh, a sound of infinite exhaustion. He limped over to an old, dusty chair and sat down, the flashlight beam now illuminating his own face. It was a face carved with wrinkles, with deep, intelligent eyes that looked like they had seen too much. "The shadow has a name," he said, his voice low. "His name is Vicente, and he wasn't a lover. He was a demon your grandmother made a pact with to protect her family, to protect your father when he was just a boy." Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine. "Vicente? What pact?" she whispered. "Helena was part of something, a movement. People who wanted freedom." He said the word with irony. "But Vicente was the leader, and he was dangerous. When your grandmother wanted out, he wouldn't allow it. He threatened everyone she loved. So she made a deal. She would give him something he desperately wanted, something she had found, in exchange for her family's safety, and she would disappear, live a life of silence, like a nun in her own convent. Miguel reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A photograph. He tossed it onto the floor, and it slid through the dust to Clara's feet. It was the same photo of the mysterious woman, the one from the box in the garden. "You think that's your grandmother, don't you?" Miguel said. "It's not. It's her sister, Lydia. My wife." The air left Clara's lungs. "Lydia was the first price Vicente collected," Miguel continued, his voice thick with old pain. "He took her. And Helena, to protect us, to protect her son, gave him what he wanted and made the pact of silence. But the debt was never fully paid. Vicente always wanted more. The diary. The diary contains the location of the one thing that can destroy him. That's why I'm here. That's why he, or his men, will be coming too." The love letter Clara had read before now made a terrible kind of sense. It wasn't about a lost love. It was a veiled threat. "I will always be here waiting." What? What happened to Lydia? Clara asked, her voice choked. "No one knows. She vanished. And I've spent my entire life looking for her. And looking for a way to end Vicente. Your grandmother and I. We planned this for years. The diary is the key. Give it to me, Clara. Let me finish this." He held out his hand. For a moment, Clara almost gave in. The weight of the diary in her hands was crushing. But something stopped her. Her grandmother's words in the first letter. "The key you need does not open the door you expect." The diary wasn't meant to be delivered. It was meant to be used. "No," she said, standing up, the diary held firmly in her hands. "She left it for me. I'll finish this." Miguel's face tightened, a mixture of disappointment and reluctant respect. "You're just like her. So stubborn, so brave, and so foolish." He stood up, the weariness evident in his movements. "Fine. Keep it. But know this. You just painted a target on your back. The final answer isn't in those pages. The diary is a map. A map that leads to the ruins, on the other side of town. Go there. But go fast. Because now, they know you have the map. And they won't ask as nicely as I did." Miguel turned and limped out of the attic, leaving Clara alone in the darkness, the beam of his flashlight disappearing down the stairs. The silence returned, but now it was filled with names, with real dangers, and with a destiny she could no longer avoid. Clara now has a name, an enemy, and a destination, the ruins. But is Miguel an ally or a manipulator? And what awaits her in the ruins that could destroy a man like Vicente? The search for answers has become a race against time. If you need to know what happens next, like, subscribe, and get ready for the next chapter. The sound of the front door closing echoed in the attic like a judgment. Clara was paralyzed for a single, long second. The diary pressed against her chest. Miguel was gone. But the danger he described now had a sound, a presence. She had no time. His warning, "Go fast. Because now they know," was a drumbeat in her mind. Shedding her caution, she raced down the stairs, skipping the last few steps. The diary was a map. She opened it on the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she flipped through the frantic pages. There was no X marking the spot. The map was the text itself, a puzzle of metaphors. The shadow hides where the thread twists. Look beneath the eye of the blind bird. The debt is recorded in black and white. Where the thread twists. The phrase spun in her head. The town had an industrial history. The old textile mill, abandoned for decades, was on the outskirts of town. The ruins. That was it. Grabbing her car keys and stuffing the diary and the heavy iron key into her bag, she slipped out the back door, plunging into the darkness of the yard. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. The road was dark, the trees forming a black tunnel over the asphalt. The only sound was the hum of the car's engine. Her eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, holding steady behind her. Her entire body tensed. Was it them? The car followed her for several miles. She made a sharp turn onto an unplanned side street. The headlights continued straight. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, but the relief was fleeting. Paranoia was now her constant companion. The ruins of the mill were even more imposing at night. The brick skeleton rose against the starless sky like a sleeping monster. A rusted iron gate blocked the main entrance, but a section of the barbed wire fence to the side was torn down, offering a way in. With her heart in her throat, Clara parked her car far away, in the darkness of a side street, and slipped through the opening. The air inside the compound was cold and smelled of rust, damp concrete, and decay. Using her phone's flashlight, she entered the main building. The beam of light danced over rusted weaving machines, silent as tombs, covered in cobwebs that looked like shrouds. The eye of the blind bird, she whispered to herself, her voice sounding small in the vast space. She searched, the light beam sweeping across the high brick walls. And then she saw it. High on the back wall, there was a large circular window, its glass long shattered, leaving only the dark metal frame. It looked like an empty eye, and carved in the brick just above the window was the old company logo. A bird, the same one from the wax seal, the same from her grandmother's drawings. The blind bird. She ran to the wall. The beam of light focused on the area directly beneath the window. The wall seemed solid. Desperation began to bubble up. Was she wrong? She ran her hands over the cold, damp bricks, feeling every crack, every imperfection. And then, one of the bricks shifted under her hand. Just a millimeter. Using her nails and the tip of the iron key, she pried the brick out. Behind it, a dark compartment. With her heart racing uncontrollably, she reached her hand into the hole and pulled out a metal box. It was heavy and locked with a modern padlock, not an antique one. Her grandmother's key wouldn't work. For a moment, panic seized her. But when she shook the box, she heard something loose rattling inside. With a rock she found on the ground, she smashed at the padlock repeatedly, the metallic bangs echoing unnervingly through the silent factory. With a final crack, the lock broke. Inside the box, there were no love letters. There was a black-covered ledger, and a small object wrapped in cloth. She opened the ledger first. The handwriting was precise, cold. These were records. Names, dates, amounts. The names of influential people in town next to exorbitant numbers. It was a record of extortion, of blackmail, of a web of corruption controlled by a single name that appeared at the top of every page. Vicente. The debt. It was all there, in black and white. Then she unwrapped the object. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. With a trembling finger, she opened it. Inside there were no portraits. There was a small engraving. Forever yours, L. Lydia. The final proof. That's when she heard it. The sound of tires on gravel outside. Powerful headlights flooded the factory interior through the broken windows, trapping her in their glare. The sound of car doors slamming. Male voices low and urgent. The boss said she'd be here. Search everywhere. They had arrived. Panic gave way to pure adrenaline. Grabbing the ledger and the locket, she shoved them back into her bag and ran, diving into the labyrinthine darkness of the weaving machines. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness behind her, hunting her. There! One of them shouted. She ran, tripping over debris, the sound of her own gasps mixing with the men's shouts. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew the factory's layout from old town stories. There was a loading dock in the back. She pushed a pile of empty barrels, which rolled with a crash, creating a momentary distraction. In the chaos, she slipped down a dark side corridor. She found the heavy metal door of the loading dock. It was barred by a rusty iron rod. Using all her strength, she heaved it up. The bar crashed to the floor with a deafening clang. She pulled the door open just enough to squeeze through and burst out into the cold night, running without looking back. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs protested. She only stopped when she reached a lit street, miles away, leaning against a lamppost, gasping for air. She looked at her hands. They were dirty and scraped, but they clutched her bag tightly. She had the proof. She had the weapon that could destroy Vicente. But as she looked into the city's shadows, she realized the terrible truth. She was no longer a granddaughter discovering a secret. She was a fugitive, carrying a truth that could get her killed. Clara has the proof, but now she's the prey. Vicente and his men will stop at nothing. How can she use what she's discovered without being silenced forever? The turning point in her family's history is about to happen. Like, subscribe, and hold your breath for the coming climax. The fluorescent hum of a 24-hour bus station was a precarious sanctuary. Clara was huddled on a cold plastic seat, her bag containing the ledger and the locket held in her lap with a grip that turned her knuckles white. Every person who walked by was a potential threat. Every pair of headlights on the street was their car, coming to finish the job. The escape from the mill had left her with the taste of rust and panic in her mouth. She was a fugitive. Prey. She couldn't go home. She couldn't call her parents. There was only one person who might understand: Miguel. But how to contact him? Her cell phone was a tracker in her pocket. With trembling hands, she turned it off. Then, a memory, one of the last conversations with her grandmother. In an emergency, payphone numbers still work, and some friends still answer them. It had been a strange, old-fashioned piece of advice at the time. Now it was her only hope. On the station wall, a grimy payphone. She stared at it as if it were a relic from another era. Using the few coins she had, she dialed the number Miguel had scribbled on a napkin before disappearing from the attic. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello. Miguel's voice came through, tense and suspicious. I have them, Clara said, her voice low and rushed. The ledger. The locket. They almost got me at the mill. A long silence on the other end of the line. Where are you? He finally asked. I don't know. The central station. Miguel, what do I do? Stay calm. Go to the Cathedral of St. Jude in the old square. It's big, always has people, but the corners are dark. Sit in the last pew on the left side. Don't talk to anyone. I'll find you. The line went dead. The walk to the cathedral was the longest of her life. Every step was heavy, every shadow a threat. The massive church door was open. Inside, the silence was profound, the air cold and fragrant with the smell of candle wax and incense. She did as he said, sliding into the last pew, in the dim light, her heart pounding against her ribs. Minutes later, which felt like hours, Miguel's figure materialized beside her in the pew, like a ghost. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the distant altar. You have them, he whispered. Clara opened her bag and showed him the black ledger. Miguel reached out and touched the cover with a dark reverence. The weapon Helena and I spent 30 years looking for. It's not enough, Clara said. I have the proof against Vicente, but I still don't understand. Why my grandmother? Why the silence? And what, exactly, does this debt have to do with me? Miguel turned to her for the first time. The dim light from the stained glass windows illuminated his tired eyes, filled with an infinite sadness. Helena had no choice, he said, his voice low and raspy. Vicente wasn't some stranger she met in a movement. He was close, far too close. He paused, as if gathering the strength to speak the next words. When your father, John, was just a baby, Helena did everything to protect him. Vicente wanted power, and Helena was the only one who knew of his crimes. He cornered her. There was no love affair, Clara. There was a night of violence and fear, a night that resulted in a pregnancy. Clara's world stopped turning. Miguel's words made no sense. Pregnancy? But my father had already been born. Miguel's eyes met hers, and the truth hit her with the force of a physical impact. No, not her grandmother. The other woman. The woman in the photo. Lydia, Clara whispered, feeling the air leave her lungs. My great-aunt. His wife. Yes, Miguel confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Vicente got Lydia pregnant. He didn't love her. He saw her as property, a way to bind himself to their family. But the child she carried was the one thing in the world he wanted, an heir. And what happened? Clara's question was a thread of a voice. Lydia ran. Helena helped her escape. That's why Vicente hunted her for her entire life. Helena's pact of silence wasn't to protect a love secret. It was to protect the whereabouts of her sister and her child, and to protect her own family from Vicente's rage. The debt was the son he never had. A knot of ice formed in Clara's stomach. The story was terrible, but it still felt distant. a tragedy from a past generation. But what about me? My grandmother's letter, the diary, everything seemed to point to me. Why? Miguel closed his eyes for a moment. Because the story didn't end there, Clara. Lydia. She couldn't raise the child alone. She was being hunted. A few years later, desperate, she came back. And she left the baby in the care of the only person in the world she trusted. The silence in the cathedral felt crushing. Clara felt the floor disappear from under her feet. She looked down at her own hands, which suddenly seemed to belong to a stranger. A baby that Helena and her husband raised as their own. Miguel continued, his voice breaking. A child they loved and protected, but whose past was too dangerous a secret to ever be told. A boy named John. Air. She couldn't breathe. John. Her father. His coldness. His anger at the sight of the photo. His fear. It wasn't because he knew the story. It was because he was the story. My father is. She couldn't finish the sentence. He is Lydia's son. And Vicente's, Miguel said, finally uttering the full truth. Which makes Vicente, the monster we're hunting, your grandfather. The turn wasn't in the family history. It was in her own identity. The phrase, the truth is in the blood, now burned in her mind with a literal and monstrous meaning. The enemy's blood ran in her veins. She didn't cry. The shock was too deep for tears. She picked up the ledger, its weight now unbearable. The weapon to destroy her own grandfather. Her grandmother's inheritance wasn't a secret. It was a mission that only she, the granddaughter Vicente never even knew existed, could complete. She looked up at Miguel, the confusion and horror in her face giving way to a determination as cold as steel. What do we do now? The truth has been revealed, and it's more shocking than we could have imagined. Clara isn't just fighting for her family's past. She's fighting against her own bloodline. How can someone destroy their own grandfather to save everyone? The final confrontation is inevitable. Like, subscribe, because the last chapter of this saga will be about justice, sacrifice, and liberation. The silence in the dim light of the cathedral wasn't peaceful, but shell-shocked. Miguel's words, your grandfather, hung in the cold air, a monstrous truth that rewrote Clara's entire existence. The blood in her veins, once a connection to her parents and the grandmother she loved, now linked her to a monster. For a moment, the weight of the ledger in her bag seemed unbearable. But then the shock morphed into something else. A cold, crystalline anger. The legacy of her grandmother, Helena, and her great-aunt, Lydia, wasn't fear. It was resistance. And now the mission was hers. What do we do now? She asked Miguel, her voice firm, devoid of any tremor. Miguel looked at her, seeing the shift in her eyes. The frightened girl was gone. The weapon you have there, he said, gesturing to Clara's bag, only works if it hits the right target. The local police, too many of them are on Vicente's payroll. We can't trust them. So we go over their heads, Clara said, her mind working fast. The press. A journalist who isn't afraid of him. Miguel considered this, then nodded slowly. I know a name. An investigative reporter in the capital. A man Vicente tried to silence years ago and failed. But for this, we need more than the ledger. We need the story. Your story. First, though, there was a debt to be paid. Not Vicente's, but hers. The debt of truth to the man who had raised her. The return to her parents' house was silent. Clara and Miguel let themselves in unannounced. They found John and Maria in the living room, the tension between them palpable. Seeing Clara and the older, unknown man beside her, they both stood up. Clara, where have you been? We were so. Maria began, but her voice trailed off when she saw the look on her daughter's face. I know everything, Clara said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. She placed the bag on the coffee table and took out the black ledger and the silver locket. I know about Lydia, about Vicente, and about Grandma's pact of silence. Maria's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filled with dread. But John didn't move. He just stood there, his face a stone mask, but for the first time Clara saw the cracks. The confusion and pain of a lifetime being held back by a superhuman force of will. Dad, Clara said, her voice softening now. You're not who you think you are. Grandma Helena and Grandpa Mario. They loved you more than anything, but they weren't your biological parents. She told him everything. The story of Lydia, the terror of Vicente, the escape, the desperate return. The baby left in the care of a sister who swore to protect him with her own life. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. John sank onto the sofa, not like a defeated man, but like someone from whose shoulders an invisible, 50-year weight had just been lifted. He looked at his own hands, then at Maria, and finally at Clara. I always knew, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Not the details. But I knew. I didn't belong. That there was a shadow, a fear. That wasn't mine, but that I carried. His eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of a painful understanding. My mother, Helena, she protected me. That night, the family's wall of silence crumbled, and in its place, for the first time, they began to build a bridge. The next day was a blur of action. Guided by Miguel, Clara met the journalist. In an anonymous hotel room, she gave him the ledger, her grandmother's diary, and the locket. She told him the entire story, not as a victim, but as the heir to a fight. There was no gunfight or high-speed chase. Clara's weapon was quieter and more devastating: the truth. 3 days later, the story exploded. Vicente's face was on every news channel, not as a respectable businessman, but as the head of a ring of corruption and extortion. The ledger was irrefutable. The story of Lydia, corroborated by Helena's diary and Miguel's testimony, painted a portrait of a monster. With pressure from the national media and federal authorities, Vicente's local protection crumbled. The word "arrested," in banner headlines next to his picture in the next day's paper, was the final word. Weeks later, the dust had settled. Clara returned to her grandmother's house. The air was no longer heavy with secrets, but light and quiet. She went up to the attic and picked up the dark wooden box and the iron key, the key that had started it all. She no longer saw it as a burden, but as a tool that had served its purpose. It had opened the door to the truth, and the truth had set her free. It had set them all free. She placed the key back in its box, along with the diary and Lydia's locket, which had been recovered. She closed the lid. She wasn't hiding the past, but honoring it, giving it a place to rest. She went down to the garden, where everything had begun. The afternoon sun warmed her face. She took a deep breath, the air for the first time in days not feeling charged with danger, but with possibility. The weight of her lineage wasn't a curse, it was a fact. Vicente's blood ran in her veins, but so did the blood of Helena and Lydia, blood of courage and sacrifice. What she did with that inheritance was her choice, and she had chosen freedom. The real secret of the past wasn't the darkness it held, but the strength one could find by bringing it into the light. And Clara, standing in her grandmother's garden, was no longer the keeper of a secret, but the author of a new beginning. Clara's journey teaches us that sometimes the most important inheritances aren't the ones we receive, but the ones we choose to claim. The truth can be a powerful weapon, and liberation the greatest victory. If this story touched you, like, subscribe, and share what it means to you to be truly free. Thank you for joining us.